The third and final season of the Deutschland saga, Deutschland 89, has just launched in the UK a couple of days ago. So this is the perfect time to celebrate this sensational TV series and to enjoy an in-depth talk with the key creatives behind it. I first came across Deutschland 83 in 2015 when I was planning the launch of a streaming service dedicated to international subtitle drama with Channel 4. And I remember perfectly well the first episode I saw. I was in my kitchen actually, and it was still very much a work in progress as an episode from the distributor. It had a slightly different mock-up title sequence, but I was utterly mesmerized from the first shot. The tone, style and feel was oozing Mad Men class, a superb cinematic feel infused with beauty, but also brimming with tension, nail-biting action, humour and social satire. I'd always been a fan of international drama, but I'd never seen anything like it. Superb writing, snappy directing and an explosive blend of tones and genres. I decided literally there and then, within the first 10 minutes of that one episode, that this would be the launch show for Walter Presents in the UK. Channel 4 came on board enthusiastically and they decided to put the series in the most competitive and prestigious slot of the year. I remember it well. First week of January, Sunday night, 9 p.m. The competition on the night was utterly fierce. We had massive juggernaut dramas, War and Peace on BBC One, the launch of Endeavour on ITV1, and a big Hollywood movie, I think it was something like Legally Blonde, on 5, which always rates. So on the night of transmission, I sat through it, literally biting my nails and thinking the next day is going to be an absolute disaster in terms of ratings. But actually, the results surprised us all beyond our wildest dreams. The programme bagged over 1.5 million viewers live and consolidated a week later with 4 million, which made it the highest rating foreign language drama ever in the UK. It was a historical result which set Deutschland in a completely different league from even the most successful Scandinoirs we all knew and loved. The series went on to win a much-deserved international Emmy, a score of awards around the world, and it has become one of the biggest global hits ever to come out of Germany. Intriguingly, the explosion of the Deutschland phenomenon is a story about the evolution of the broadcasting landscape and ecosystem, which is why it's such an interesting cultural case study in the broader sense for our industry. The series was originally commissioned by RTL, big commercial broadcaster in Germany. But the phenomenon took off way beyond Germany. In fact, I remember hearing that the initial overnights from RTL were slightly disappointing, but the streaming figures started to build up more and more impressively. So this series was landing at the time where terrestrial overnight ratings were becoming less important in shaping and defining the success of a program. The show quickly became a cult hit around the world, and Amazon had the cleverness and the foresight to pick up the brand and back it for the second and third installment globally. I've always loved the show and the story of its trajectory within the broadcasting system, and I really love the fact that it was conceived as a trilogy from the start. So that following a very precise 3-act structure, to me, gave it really additional editorial and emotional gravitas. The creative powerhouse behind the series are husband and wife duo writer Hannah Winger and producer Joa Winger. And today they are going to be speaking to journalist Stephen Armstrong, who like me is quite passionate about international drama, and they're going to reveal all the secrets behind their iconic creation. The perfect way to celebrate the end of a momentous trilogy. Thank you, Hannah and Jörg, for bringing us the show that truly changed the telly landscape. Enjoy the session.
Das war die bislang größte Demonstration, die Leipzig seit Beginn der Proteste erlebt hat.
Die Regierung plant ein neues Reisegesetz. Streng geheim. Du bist der offizielle HVA-Kurier.
Aber Sie wissen, dass Kolibri gern aus der Reihe tanzt.
Was glaubst du, würde passieren, wenn die Mauer fallen würde?
Das wäre das Ende der DDR.
Ist es wirklich von Moskau genehmigt?
Ja.
Stellen die Ausreisen können über alle Grenzübergangsstellen der DDR zur BRD erfolgen. Das tritt nach meiner Kenntnis ist das sofort.
Ich glaube, dass ich das war.
Ach du Scheiße.
Was ist das Beste an einer Staatskrise? Ganz neue Möglichkeiten.
Willkommen bei der HVA im Exil.
Wir sehen uns drüben, auf der anderen Seite dieses Krieges.
Scheiße, das erlebt man ja nicht so oft, dass sich ein Land komplett neu erfinden muss.
Denken Sie drüber nach. Aber nicht zu lange. Time is moving fast.
Die Leute schreien nach Freiheit. Und was sie kriegen, ist Kapitalismus.
Harte Zeiten erfordern harte Maßnahmen.
Oh mein Gott!
War das ganz ohne Waffe?
So besser?
Well, good afternoon. So I'm struggling with the internet welcome, and usually used to the big halls packed with RTS audiences. But so I'd like to thank Walter for his intro and introduce you to Anna and Jörg Winger in a moment. Instead of questions in the traditional sense, which is where you put your hand up and ask the questions, there's a YouTube chat box which you can put questions in for a Q&A at the end, which will run smoothly and without fault. So I'm going to introduce now Anna and Jörg, the creators, a husband and wife team. Anna's a British-American screenwriter. She is an essayist and novelist as well, as if screenwriter wasn't enough. Alongside co-creating Deutschland, she is the creator of Unorthodox and the founder of Studio Airlift, which is a series incubator in Berlin. Jörg, before Deutschland, he made 300 episodes of the multi-award nominated primetime series Soko Leipzig on Germany's ZDF. I've said that wrong, I realise. He's also a creator and executive producer of award-winning international co-production Hackerville on HBO Europe. And together they made Deutschland 89. Initially, of course, Deutschland 83, Deutschland 86, and it's an overarching story about really the bringing together of the Germanys. I'd like to ask you about the whole thing initially, but perhaps given the nature of the way we're talking, perhaps we could open with a scene from, I think it's episode 4, which is terrifyingly prescient. You tell us about how you'd been making the show, and then maybe we can cue in the horrifying truth of what you'd predicted. 2019, I think, was the year you were wrapping.
We shot the whole thing in the fall of 2019, before COVID, and there would have been no way to predict the lives we're all living now, but it does appear that we predicted it when you watch this scene.
So yeah, can we cue up the scene? The scene from episode 4, where the East Germans are explaining how computers are going to look.
Bereit? Der Robo Phoenix.
Und wieso ist da eine Kamera auf dem Bildschirm?
Diese Kamera, das ist der USP. Unique Selling Point.
Es ist der einzigartige Verkaufspunkt.
Es gibt eine ganz neue technische Entwicklung, die es erlaubt, dass die Computer sich miteinander vernetzen, sodass die Nutzer sich gegenseitig sehen können. Und wissen Sie, wer die Möglichkeiten, die da entstehen, jetzt schon erkannt hat? Er. Und ich.
Wer wird denn gerne beobachtet, wenn er vorm Computer sitzt?
Na, Sie können zum Beispiel mit Ihrer Frau sprechen, wenn Sie mal auf Geschäftsreise sind.
Oder Sie lassen Ihre Angestellten überwachen, zum Beispiel wenn Sie die Produktionsziele nicht einhalten.
Es gibt vielfältige Nutzungsmöglichkeiten. Militärisch, zivil, das ist jetzt nicht...
Sie sind alle aus der DDR, oder?
Ja.
Ja. Nein.
Sind Sie von der Stasi?
Nein, also...
Ich hatte nämlich so Gerüchte gehört, dass die Stasi ihre Bürger auf eine erschreckende Art und Weise ausspioniert hat. Also mag das hier für Sie vielleicht normal sein. Aber in einer offenen und demokratischen westlichen Gesellschaft, da wird niemand jemals irgendjemanden erlauben, andere bei der Arbeit oder privat zu beobachten.
Love that. So briefly, what's going on there? Why? How did that scene? What is that scene showing?
Well, I think it's, we have the privilege of looking at this in hindsight. So, already in 2019, we were not as much as we do today, but we were already being, surveillance capitalism was beginning to be a buzzword. And of course, that's where basically the GDR's core competence, or the Stasi's core competence, is meeting, today's issues. And we always looked at history as a metaphor for what's happening today. I think you kind of automatically do that. And so for me, I think that's exactly how people would have reacted to the suggestion of having a camera pointing at you at your laptop. And this is the situation we're all finding ourselves in now.
And Anna, I think I've heard you talk about the purpose of the whole series in terms of comparing what the series is about to what's going on today. What's the overarching philosophy of all three in the trilogy placed together?
Well, I think we always set out to track the end of something. And I mean, of course, we're looking at late stage communism, late stage socialism, but I think we're living through late stage capitalism. And it was always interesting to us how, you see, men sitting around a big table trying to hold on to power by any means necessary. And there was always some humor and tragedy in that we found in using history as a metaphor for what we were living through. I mean, I think you're always writing about the present, even when you're writing about the past.
So do you guys remember where you were on 1989 when the war came in? Because that's how you start this season. I mean, you've been building up to it, obviously, through the first two seasons. Yeah. We've been seeing the East struggle, the West embrace the East with loans. We can see where we're going because we know the history of it. And where were you when the Scorpions started singing about the wall coming down?
Well, where I was is boring. I was in university in New York, but Jorg has a very good story about that.
Well, I was doing my mandatory military service in West Germany, so I was as far away as from the GR as you could be, but with very high antennas, and we were listening to the Russian troops in the GDR that very day, and with our big headphones, and we were trying to decipher what they were saying to each other. But that very day, they were talking about the usual stuff, because they also didn't know that the wall was about to come down. So finally, somebody from the officer quarters came running into our room and telling us that we should all turn on the TVs because the wall is coming down. So that's that's how good, we were great spies. We had no idea. And we were just as surprised as anyone else.
But that spying also was the idea that your initial idea from the series began with that room, if I remember rightly.
That's true, because we did listen to the Russians, but the Russians knew that we were listening, and on holidays they would greet us, not me. I was just a very low grade kind of unpaid mandatory. I was just doing my military service, but the officers' names, they would call them out by their names. And so we knew that there was someone in our ranks who was selling or handing over information to the Russians. So we knew we had a mole. And then, Anna had the idea of telling this story from the perspective of the mole, of the East German mole.
And so you start this season with the wall going down, which is kind of starting with a bang. It would be tempting, I guess, to end with that, because that's the pivotal moment. Why did you choose to start there and then tell about the aftermath of this?
Well, that because I think in Germany you have seen the lead up to the fall of the wall many times in many different programs, but I think for us the most important and the most interesting question was, how do people reinvent themselves when their country, their organization, and everything around them is falling apart? How do people deal with a crisis of that magnitude? Also, I think the world of the GDR after the wall came down was incredibly fascinating, because it was a space of opportunity. It was, there were loads of utopias that were dreamed up in the months after the wall came down. What we have forgotten is that it was totally unclear what was about to happen. It was far from clear that we were going into an era of reunification or annexation by the West. people were dreaming of a new socialism, a better socialism. Many people were against reunification. You might remember Margaret Thatcher's attitude, or François Mitterrand, who said at the time that he loves Germany so much that he'd rather have two. We love this moment of uncertainty and many ideas, and then we follow through that time until it's decided that basically East Germany will become a part of West Germany, and that's the end of Deutschland 89 and the entire trilogy.
Also, I think everybody always expected it to end with the wall coming down. So for us, it's fun to write into the gray areas of history and to find the spaces to tell the stories that people don't know already. So we've sort of consistently done that from the start. And so it was just a great place to begin with the thing everyone expected to be the culmination of 3 seasons.
And what I loved, I watched the first episode at the same time as Putin's Palace had just been released on YouTube, and watching how Vlad was sitting in his safe house in Dresden watching these events. And then you follow a lot of the Stasi and how the Stasi then go about dealing with this particular situation. And you realize that in charge of Russia right now, we have one of the people effectively who you're following is now running the Russian state. What, perhaps just without spoiling anything, what do we follow? What stories do you choose to tell in terms of this season?
Well, the meta theme is reinvention. So we follow basically most of the characters we already know and have, love. We had to get rid and cut out some of the characters we love too, but not because we don't love them anymore. Basically just entirely because of budget reasons. But we really were interested in the opportunities for those characters and what decisions will they make in the new era, in this new world. And history was a guide again, because they were all very competent, they were all very well connected in the world, and so they had lots of opportunities. A lot of the very capable Stasi agents, HVA agents, became successful business people. Some of them just took money or gold and ran away. Others stayed true to the communist ideas and tried to fight reunification and the influx of capitalism. And so it was a really interesting crossroads. So there were threats and there were challenges. They were also very afraid that they would all end up in prison or being murdered basically by another agency. But most of them got hired, not shot.
And there's a scene which I think it'd be lovely to see where you crystallize that in a very human story, which is the story of Tina Fischer, who escapes West and comes back and tries to deal with the very personal effects of the Stasi agents and the way that East Germany is dealing with what they did. And so we've got a second clip, which perhaps we could show, and you could just explain to us afterwards.
Die Stasi hatte 10.000 Angestellte. Die haben alle nur Befehle befolgt.
Das haben wir alles schon mal in Deutschland
Kommen
gehört.
Sie, unterstehen Sie sich, uns mit den Nazis zu vergleichen, bitte?
Uns? Dann gehören Sie also doch dazu.
Nein.
Und Sie haben Angst vor der Wahrheit.
Nein! Und obwohl ich nicht dieser Mann bin, es stimmt, ich habe Angst. Große Angst sogar. Nur weil ich ab und zu mal in Hohenschönhausen war, da werde ich einfach so, wie gerade von Ihnen, mitverurteilt. Deshalb habe ich Angst. Ich hab Angst um meine Kinder. Ich habe Angst um meine Familien, um die Familien meiner Kollegen.
Kinder haben ein Recht darauf, die Wahrheit über ihre Eltern zu erfahren.
Über ihre Eltern, ihre Brüder, ihre Schwestern, ihre Lehrer. Wo fangen sie an? Die Stasi war eine Riesenmaschine. Was wäre, wenn wir die alle über einen Kamm scheren würden? Es stimmt ja. Es stimmt, einige waren sicherlich schrecklich zu anderen. Aber die meisten, die haben einfach unserem Land gedient. Die haben Akten überbracht, Grenzen bewacht, Regeln befolgt.
Die Gerichte werden von Fall zu Fall urteilen.
Wenn es nach ihnen ginge, dann müsste ein Großteil des Landes vor Gericht.
Ja,
Das mag sein. Ich weiß jedenfalls, was richtig und was falsch ist.
Ja. Sie sind natürlich eine von den Guten, nicht wahr?
Ich habe nie mit der Stasi kooperiert, wenn Sie das meinen.
Sie ganz allein. Sie haben die Entscheidung getroffen, in den Westen zu fliehen. Das mag sich für Sie moralisch richtig anfühlen, aber wissen Sie was? Ein Verbrechen war es trotzdem. Sie sind keine von den Guten, Tina. Sind Sie nicht.
So, what's that scene doing for the series? Perhaps just briefly talk around that.
Well, another meta theme, if you want to call it that, for this season is justice, and this might ring familiar to a lot of people who have watched and observed German history over the last 100 years, because Germany has changed its political system 4 times completely, including currency, political regime. We went from monarchy to failed democracy, to fascism, to communism, back to democracy. So we're always interested in, how do you justify what you did in a system that told you that certain things are okay, and then the regime changes, and all of a sudden you're a criminal. And so the question of guilt and rationalization of guilt is a growing German theme, and I think the reflection on that is very interesting. So what's actually happening in the scene is that this is the man who interrogated Tina when she was in an East German prison in 1986, and after the wall comes down, he is afraid that people will bring him to justice. So he comes to her house, which is really scary, but which is something that actually happened quite a lot. And this is what you see now, what you saw now is basically the warm-up to a really intense conversation that turns into something else at a later point.
I still remember that the person we interviewed at the prison, which is where we set this Tina's story, told us that she saw the person who interrogated her on an escalator in a mall after the wall came down. The crazy part about German history is that after all these terrible things happened, whether you're talking about the Nazi time or the GDR, everybody continued to live here, right? So it's not like things change and then the people leave. They're still living in the same mix. And I think that's what we find really fascinating.
I mean, one thing I personally think about Berlin when you go is how open Germany is about its history. I mean, it's very hard to find walking through Berlin a monument that does not say this is something terrible that happened here. And I think that's something that in the UK we're only just beginning to discuss with statues. These are conversations that Germany's been having for a very long time. And I think that's the openness of this show. But is it also a difficult story to tell? Was there resistance in Germany when the show went out to the ideas that any of these stories were being told?
I don't think by the time we made this show that people had a difficult time with that. I think sometimes they had a difficult time with the humor in the show because they felt like possibly we weren't treating it seriously enough. But I would not say that people are trying to sweep the history under the rug in this country. It's very different from how, say, the UK or the US deals with slavery and colonial history. I think there is a very open acknowledgement here of the things that have happened, and that's actually something that is a relief about living here. There's something inspiring in a way about how they confront their own history.
And you were saying earlier that there were some stories that didn't make it into 89 from 83 and 86, the Adels and Et. And is that purely budgetary, or are there any kind of more philosophical reasons for those stories not continuing?
No, it's truly, and this is our big. I mean, this is how. I mean, we benefited so much. Don't get me wrong, from the new age of television or streaming. So we're really happy to be able to tell these stories in this way. But we made our contracts 5 years ago, and the world has moved on, and we're trying to compete in the way the show looks and feels with international drama. So we have real budget restraints, so we had to cut out some storylines that we had already written and then had to throw out very sadly in the final stage before.
Most dramatically, the story of Alex Adel and Tishbir and that romance.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting you're saying about the international thing. The legend here is that initially 83 didn't go down as well as it later developed. And is there any sense in which the international response changed the way that Germany saw the show, or was it already being rediscovered in Germany by the time the Brits and the Americans fell for it?
It was.
America, it came out in America 6 months first. Okay.
Yeah, sorry, there's a delay here. I think the story, and that's, I think that, we started at a commercial broadcaster who had never shown this kind of show, and I think they were disappointed by the ratings initially, but I think that in Germany it became quite clear quite fast. We won a lot of awards in Germany, and then also the show in Germany moved from RTL to Amazon, so Amazon Prime Video was able to see how the show was performing on their platform, and that was a success story, and that's also why they wanted to pick it up in the next season. So we were basically really just at the crossroad between traditional broadcasting versus innovative streaming. So that's where we got caught in the middle, but in the end we benefited from that, and the international success definitely helped us to keep moving.
But just you have to imagine that we made the budget for the show in 2013-14, right? So that was before the so-called golden age of international drama, and I mean, without getting too detailed about how these things work, it's just there's more competition for talent in the marketplace. So the budgets are necessarily have gone up.
I remember speaking to a couple of the cast who came over to the UK to do promotions and were being stopped in the street in London and couldn't quite believe it, because I think it was probably thanks to Walter. It took off very quickly in the UK, and I think it caught up slower in Germany. So they, what's going on? How come we're getting recognised in Soho? This doesn't make any sense. But could you feel the UK love over there? I mean,
Sorry?
Did you feel the UK love very clearly? Was the international success felt?
Yeah, amazing. The UK audience is just incredible. They're so engaged. For us, it's been such a pleasure, like also on Twitter and social media. And I mean, I was with Jonas once on Oxford Street when he asks a woman directions, and then she totally freaked out because she recognized him.
I have to say also, now that the third season is out, Anna and I spent we have to admit, of the weekend just bathing in the response from the UK, because also I think what I'm really, I mean, of course we love the enthusiasm, but also we're very impressed with how much our British audience knows about the history, the backdrop, the political situation, the Cold War. It's very, I mean, that all of that makes us feel like the UK truly belongs into the European Union. I mean, they show themselves as real Europeans.
Yes, and we'll come to that just towards the very end. There's a point about that I think you're making. But did anything about the second and third season change as a result of the international response, or was it mapped out and you stuck to your plan?
I think each time we conceived the season when we were writing it, but I think one thing that's important to understand about the process is when you're writing something, ultimately you're writing it for yourself, in the sense that you can't focus too much on the audience. You have to sort of believe in what you're writing, and it takes on a life of its own in the writer's room. So you can't, I think it's a dangerous process to say, like, to sort of try and paint by numbers to serve the audience in that sense. but we've just been in such a positive, interesting dialogue since '83 with the people who are interested in the same stuff. And, it takes an obsessive interest in something like this to write and produce a show like this. So, I think it's been fun to connect with the people around the world who have the same crazy interests as we do.
We just had a thing here. The UK does make a lot of stuff for international broadcasters, streamers, and there has been this interesting measurement of the amount of UK references in shows that are made for international broadcasters. You guys have won an international Emmy. There's a huge international presence. Do you ever feel there's a tension between telling stories that will appeal internationally and also telling stories that are local and about the place you're from? Is that something that program makers struggle with?
My opinion. Oh, sorry. My opinion is that the more specific. Oh, sorry. We're having a delay problem. Sorry.
You go.
Okay. So my opinion is that the more specific the story, the more universally it can travel, which is sort of counterintuitive because, even with Unorthodox, which was in Yiddish, a language that almost nobody speaks, people really connected to it around the world. And I think the same is true with Deutschland, that it's like very specific, but it's about a universal story of somebody who's searching for, a way of, Jonas, Martin Rauch's character is, growing up and redefining himself politically. And also, of course, not just in terms of his country, but in terms of his family. And I think a lot of people saw themselves in him, even though he lives in a country that they most likely never visited, and of course speaks a language that many of them don't understand. So to me, the more specific a story is, and this is kind of what I meant about how you can't design a show to be popular around the world. I think or at least you can't fill in the rest of the world into something. It has to, the deeper you go down a rabbit hole of something obsessive and specific, it can kind of elevate a story to being universal.
You're going to say next, you had something on that as well.
I think that I was about to say a version of that. I would maybe add that program makers still sometimes have trouble with that, but that's because how they're organized, that sometimes, some shows that are local, deeply local, but have international appeal don't necessarily fit in their strategy, but I think all this is changing and in flux. So I think in the long term, we'll see more and more shows, just like the market for novels, let's say. You're really interested in discovering worlds that you have no access to, didn't even know existed, but then there's an emotionally universal theme that pulls you into the story.
We are getting a lot of audience questions coming in. I've got a couple of really quick ones to get through before we go to them, but there's a lot of response here. I think that what's interesting to me, I remember talking to Russell T. Davies about It's a Sin, and him explaining that It's a Sin, although being set during a time when I was alive, is now a period piece and therefore costs just as much money to shoot as a Frocks and Bonnets drama would, and that's shocking. Yes. But presumably you had the same problem here. I mean, you shot in the Stasi headquarters, the uniforms. How hard is it to do a period piece, even though it's our lives?
Very hard. It doesn't make a difference. I mean, it's just, listen, it's really hard to shoot something that doesn't take place in just normal life, period. Even Unorthodox was like shooting a costume drama that was contemporary. And with Deutschland, it was very challenging because you have to just imagine that as soon as someone goes outside, you have to change all the cars in the street. So that in that case, it doesn't matter if it's like 1800 or it's 1985. You can't shoot on the street unless you change the cars. That's, I think, a really good litmus test for whether it's going to be expensive.
And since it's Berlin or Leipzig or Dresden, you have to change basically everything because all these cities have changed in a way that no other cities in the Western world, at least, have changed over the last 30 years.
Yeah, you still got, I love the way you still got those Eastern all the electric and cables went over the top instead of underneath, and it's just those little signature moves, which I think is lovely. So we've talked a bit about the political climate of today and how the show reflects that. There's a scene that ends, and this is not a spoiler, I don't think, but there's an amazing sequence at the end, which I'd like to show, and then have you talk a bit about that choice of making that, because I think it doesn't make sense unless we've seen it to talk about it. So we could show the final clip.
Naja, der Kalte Krieg ist vorbei. Kapitalismus und Demokratie haben gesiegt. Gibt auch keine Alternative mehr. Wer braucht da noch Spione?
In the eye of a hurricane, listen to yourself churn. In the eye of a hurricane, listen to yourself turn. The world serves its own needs. Does your heart bleed? In the eye of a hurricane, listen to yourself churn. Ooh, it's the end of the world as we know it. It's the end of the world as we know it. It's the end of the world as we know it. And I feel
So tell me about that.
Yes, well, we might, the ones of us who were around in those years might remember that, Francis Fukuyama wrote a best-selling nonfiction book called The End of History. And that's what I believed, in a way. I thought, now basically this battle between ideologies is over, and now every country will become a liberal democracy, over the next few years. And for the next few years, it did look like that. And we thought that, capitalism is this great thing. I mean, I guess we thought that if we have capitalism and it's better, then what we need now is more capitalism. And if democracy is better, then we need more democracy and more referendums, etc. And then, now we're in a time where I think the paradigm shift has happened, and we see that maybe we need a different kind of capitalism, and democracy is certainly under threat and is going to be reformed in one way or another. So now history is back. Basically, we saw the return of history, and something that I never could imagine in 1989 or 90, that we would see countries that are pulling up walls. And that includes the wall we talk about in these last moments. The wall between the United States and Mexico. I mean, Brexit is kind of a wall too, even though there's no wall in stone. But we witnessed the first contract between two Western powers, where the parties were negotiating, how to limit free movement. How can we keep people out of our country? How can we have less trade, less exchange of ideas? I mean, that was unimaginable until quite recently. So, we start with the fall of the wall and we end with the building of walls. And, we will be in a very complex situation over the next few years.
I just want to say that I'm a British citizen, and I had to get a visa to live here. After living here for 18 years, I had to go and get a sticker in my passport. It was unimaginable. I would require that. I had been living here as a citizen for 18 years, and I had to get permission. So, and it was, it wasn't the Germans who asked that of me, right? It was my own country. So to be put in that situation is, we always use this Mark Twain quote that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And it's apt.
Well, I am currently looking for a partner with a European passport. So if you know anybody that I could, then I don't have to worry about visas. That would be lovely. Just introduce me. So there are some questions from the audience. So the first is from Philip Huxham. What do you contribute? I'm reading this off my phone, which is why I've just appeared. I'll bring the phone up here because we've got it on WhatsApp. What do you attribute the continuing fascination with the DDR so many years after the end of the state?
I can say that I think that it's not, 30 years isn't that long. And I think it's a natural thing that people are interested in something. At least living in Berlin, it's interesting. For example, our kids are growing up here, and for them, of course, they're just discovering the crazy divisions of the city. So it's one of our daughters has been doing this research about how German hip hop reflects the former divisions still, and it's been super fascinating. So I guess I would counter that question with, why wouldn't we be interested in it?
It's also living history, right? So it's basically a lot of people who are around are have been socialized and formed by a regime that is nowadays sounds like a fantasy regime to a lot of young people. I mean, fantasy in the way that it's just so different from anything we experience now.
There's a sort of a linked question here. One is from Paul Wallace, which is, and I'm just going to read it. I love this trilogy. I'm interested to know why you felt the HIV/AIDS story was so important to feature, especially in the first series. And two, the second part, Saffron Vickers' walking ads in regards to 89, whether you considered the issue of male gay erasure in the light of Act Out Manifesto when you cut Alex. There's a sort of a supplementary question to that, which is Saffron Vickers walking. Lenore was an extraordinary character. Was she entirely fictional? And I wonder if those things.
I would like to answer this because I also saw this question from the same person on Twitter, and I think that one, I thought it was, when I think about the 80s, my mother was very involved in ACT UP. I'm British and American, and my mother is British, but she was living in America at the time. And so for me, the story of AIDS and everything that happened around ACT UP was a huge part of the 80s. And so it was a really important thing to incorporate, especially in 83 and 86. And yes, we regret having to eliminate that storyline. Although we had told it quite in depth in those first two seasons, we had to cut a lot of storylines in the third season for various really budgetary reasons. So it was certainly not because we didn't think it was important, but there was more to tell about their relationship, about Alex and Tishbir's relationship that we hadn't already told. So we had to make some really difficult decisions. But I'm glad I got a chance to answer that because the same person asked it on Twitter, and I'm so bad at Twitter that I didn't really understand how to respond. So I'm glad that person asked it again.
Joe, do you want to add anything to that? Or is that?
Yeah, I mean, those, are painful cuts. And maybe the one thing, I think Anna answered it very well. And maybe the one thing I can add is that the other gay love story that we have kept on board is the Lenora Rose story that we keep telling in 89.
Oh, there's one other thing, which is that the person asked if Lenora was based on a real person. And the answer to that is actually kind of funny, which is that there were actually no women in the leadership of the Stasi, but because I'm a woman, I just put them in.
There we go.
Talking of which, what?
This is a perfect segue into the next question, which is very good to see the directors are both women. What particularly did they bring to the look and filming of the show, do you think?
Well, I think they both, for very different reasons. I mean, they both have a personal link to histories of changing regimes and of being on the losing or the winning end of regime change. That was definitely interesting for us. Also, there's very just personal reasons. Zul Youssef is a young shooting star director in Germany who I had worked with on several projects, and she was just at this point of her career where this was really interesting for her and for us at the same time. And Randa Chaoud is a director who actually had worked with Jonas on a project just before the Deutschland series started, and he highly recommended to meet her. And I didn't know her before. We didn't know her, and we met with her. And then it's always in the end when you meet a director and you talk about the stories and the characters of the show, you get a sense of how they see the material, and if you can, if you feel like you're on the same wavelength and you share a vision for the story, then then you're close to start working together. So there's always, I would say, at least 3 reasons why we hire someone as a director for the show.
Anna, do you have any add-on to that?
I mean, I think the look and feel of the show has been we've evolved it over the 3 seasons, but it's had a distinctive look from the beginning. And we've worked with, female and male directors from the beginning. Our first season was directed by 2 directors. One was a woman, one was a man. I'm not sure if the question was asking if because they were women, they brought a special look and feel to the show, but basically we hired them because they're great directors.
And what sources, Claire S asks, what sources did you use when researching to get that authentic feel? Apart, obviously, from the fact that you were in the room.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one thing that what Jörg said already is that this is living history. So on the one hand, on the one hand, we do a lot of research, but it's not all, the kind of research you do in books or by looking at documentary footage. It's also asking people, people remember this time. And when you have a question, you can seek out someone who lived it. And I think that's the privilege of working with material from the 80s and more recently is that, the people who witnessed it firsthand are available. So that's been, especially for me as someone who doesn't come from Germany and had chose Berlin as a, I moved here in my 30s. It's a way of also getting to know the history of the place that is my home.
And we also, whenever we shot in original historical locations like the Stasi, we shot in the real Stasi headquarters. Some of our actors, for example, Sylvester Groth, who left the DDR before the wall fell, he had to sit on those chairs where the people who wanted basically to persecute him were sitting. So there's also this strange confluence of the reality and people's memories. But other than
there's many people, not just Sylvester, but also, for example, our casting agents, our set designer, many people involved behind the camera in the show lived it. So it's not just a question of asking people, our friends and family. It's also, many of our collaborators lived through that time and come from East Germany. So there was a lot of sort of healthy discussion on set and throughout the creative process about the history. I mean, our casting agent was imprisoned.
The other dimension of that is that we, well, now the sun is setting in Berlin, as you might be able to see. I look like Nosferatu. But the other dimension of that is, of course, that the 80s falls into that sweet spot where people who were really active in the intelligence community are now retired, so they have the time and the desire to talk about what was actually happening. So that's always very interesting to talk with people, you know, who wouldn't have told you these stories 10 or 20 years ago.
So we have a lot of questions to get through still. The trilogy's done. Would you consider a spin-off for any of the characters? Are you done with this topic, or would you continue to explore it in any way?
And then I mean, the series is over. The trilogy is over, but of course we can't stop thinking about certain aspects of the material and the characters. So we are currently thinking about, you know, a true spin-off that is not Deutschland, but maybe follows some of our characters into new territory.
Also, it should be said that Jörg is making a show with some of our collaborators from Deutschland, upcoming, that is set in the period of the 90s in the former East Germany, that kind of deals with some of the aftermath he'll be shooting later this year. So, you know, there is, you know, we continue to, you know, one thing, you know, projects evolve out of other projects in a way. So there's a natural course of things when you're really interested in something, that it kind of, it somehow emerges in new projects as well.
There's a couple of questions about music. I'll sort of wrap them all up into one question, one from Angus and one from Zara. Angus, big fan of the theme tune. How did you decide on it? And Zara saying music's such a key part of the trilogy. Was that a decision from the outset, or did it come with the edit and the post-production? Basically, music, I guess.
Yeah, music was a big part from the beginning. I think we really chose 1983 because it was the year that German music traveled around the world. And there was this strange thing where it was a very tense period politically, but the music was really somehow bright, and it felt like the beginning of something new. So we both loved the music from that period, and that was one of the pleasures of making the show, actually, was working on the song selection and also on the score, which was made by Reinhold Heil, who was one of the producers of 99 Luftballons, and he was in the Nina Hagen band, so he was a real icon of 80s German pop. And then, the Peter Schilling. Yeah, I mean, listen, it was pretty easy to pick that song as the opening credits sequence. It's so good. I mean, we remembered it. Peter Schilling is from Berlin, and he was kind enough to let us use it, and so we were thrilled.
I mean, you say the music was very bright. I remember, although this would be 90s, a very long night at Tresor and a track which went Ein, zwei, Polizei, fünf, vier, Grenadier, which I'm hoping you'll have in your 90s follow-up to Deutschland. That was not bright, that track. That track was terrifying.
We actually used it in Hackerville.
Did you? It's a great track. So we've got, I mean, I suppose you talked a bit about the value of talking to people while they're still alive, I guess, which people retired and while they're alive. And do you think that's why the 80s is getting revisited? We've had a big hit in the UK with basically Russell T Davies looking at AIDS in It's a Sin in a way that Britain has never really looked at AIDS in the UK. There's this whole investigation of that period going on. And do you get any feeling, having done it yourself, as to why that decade is so fascinating to us now?
Well, probably it's because it's, I mean, it's referring to something we talked about earlier, is that it feels like the beginning of a cycle that is now coming to an end. You know, when basically everything seemed to be going one direction, and now we have we're discovering that, you know, this doesn't last forever. So I think there's that, and then there's also, I think, demographically speaking, I think it is, you know, TV watchers, maybe not so much for the streamers, but you know, a lot of people who are watching a series are in their 40s and 50s, and they have some living memory about the 80s, and it was really an important time for them when they were young, so they can look back and become nostalgic or not, and young people can see, you know, can rediscover it, because I think a lot of young people, I don't know what it's like in the UK, but in Germany, history doesn't cover really the 80s. So there's a lot to learn, about this era.
And Anna, do you
Yeah,
have any?
it's a sin. I mean, in answer to that, I think it's, it follows on the revival of Angels in America at the National. I think there's I think that when you look at the world that we live in, where there's a debate, or there was, in recent years, a debate around gay marriage, and then the rights of LGBTQ citizens in various countries, in all countries, or at least in the Western world, the roots of that kind of activism really find themselves in the 80s. So I think it's just an interesting thing for people our age in particular who lived through it to look at in terms of understanding the world we're in now. And I think those threads that connect us to the past are very interesting. That's a big one, actually. But there's a lot of others, especially politically related to the Cold War.
And you mentioned a bit about what you were working on, Jörg, but both of you what else are you both working on now? What should we look out for? And what's interesting you, I guess? What's grabbing your attention as writers? Who wants to go first?
You go first.
You go first.
Okay. Well, I'm working on a French-German show, actually, which is that has a certain biographical note, but then of course we go into into more interesting territory than my own life. It's a French-German thriller series. I was a huge Francophile before I met Anna and married an American. So it goes back basically to my teenage experiences in the French-German school exchange, which I'm sorry, I now will come across as someone who's obsessed about the idea of Europe, which I am. For me, it was a really important experience to be in a French-German school exchange, and my exchange student is a very dear friend of mine to this day. And I thought that these programs were amazing in building European friendships and relationships. The other one is something that has less to do with my own life and a lot more to do with the Afro-German community in Germany, and it's about the first East German, the first Black East German cop. It's based on a true story, and he had an amazing journey that took him from being a cop to becoming a bank robber, and with many twists and turns. And these are the two shows that we're planning to shoot this summer.
And Anna, how about you?
I'm working on one show that's set in the refugee crisis in Marseille in 1940. Right after Dunkirk and the fall of Paris. And it's an adventure show that also deals with some Jewish themes, like unorthodox, but sort of has more of the tone of Deutschland. And I am working on 3 projects that are set in England, which is a funny thing. I just realized that thinking about whether or not what I'm allowed to talk about and what I'm not allowed to talk about. But one of them is a spy show that's set against the struggle against sort of in the struggle against apartheid and the London machinery, and deals with African history. And I can't really talk about the others. I can't really talk about any of them. It's always unclear what one is allowed to talk about. But we're lucky to have really interesting projects to work on.
And we've got 2 minutes left. So if you could, in 2 minutes, do you think that the very fact that we're gathered together to talk about a show about made in Germany, about East Germany, and we have a Brit American and a German, and that's what television is allowing us to do. Do you see that television that is fulfilling a different role now? Do the presence of international broadcasters, streamers, these things, is this good business, or is there a kind of more philosophically joyous element to what this curiosity of how each other's cultures is doing? You can go first.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. What did you say?
I said, how do you feel about the kind of the internationalization of television? I guess.
Yes,
Do you
yes.
think it's a cultural thing?
I think it's great.
A good.
Listen, I think it's fantastic that you can make a niche project that you're obsessed with some very specific story, and you can find the other crazy people in the world who are just as interested in it. Like, isn't that a miracle? You know, we had people from like Saudi Arabia to Japan to Argentina talking about a show in Yiddish. To me, it just felt like a miracle. So somehow, to me, I think the scaling of niche content that's possible through global streaming is just an amazing thing. It doesn't change the national experience, because you're still talking to your friends and your family and your colleagues about something you watched on TV, but it provides this opportunity to have a really big conversation with a wider audience, and that's exciting.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, we're thrilled. Basically, I mean, you know, you could make the argument that it's only American streamers who are really, you know, streaming and providing this global content, but they become truly international players because they're setting up shop in every country, and they are, you know, many of them, most of them have plans or are already producing local content in many different countries that didn't even have high-end series, or in the territories like Germany, which had a very narrow definition of what a series has to look like, and was also narrow in the definition of genres that were acceptable or the stories that were possible to tell. Now it's, you know, so much more is possible, and since the competition is on, it's also everybody wants to break through the noise. So it's much more interesting for it's much easier for original stories to break through, and that's very exciting.
Thank you. Well, that brings us to the end of our session, and we did get through all the questions, so that's good. So I'd like to thank. Unfortunately, we don't have a round of applause, but if you can just imagine thunderous cheers as everyone rises to their feet. And I thank Anna and Jörg for the show and for taking part. Damien Ashton-Wellman, who produced, and Philip Barnes, who directed. And now we are going to see some promo cards, and I'm going to try and sell you more RTS events in an exciting and attractive way. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you so much.
We've got...
for having us.
So join the Vivian live as the RTS celebrates the best and brightest young talent from across London region at the annual RTS London Student Awards tomorrow night, and that is a good picture. And also, when is streaming coming to the rescue of the creative industries? That's the question that journalist and TV presenter Nadine DeReza, sorry, I beg your pardon. Nadine DeReza is asking in this session, looking at the emerging business models around live streaming on March the 24th. And James Corden, obviously, who's helping Meghan and Harry make a good deal out of streaming, won't be taking part. But thank you very much. All the details for booking these will be on the RTS website, which is on screen now, and at the link in the description. So thank you very much, RTS, and thank you very much, Berlin. This is London signing off.
Thank you, London.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.